You don't just wake up one morning and decide to walk away from the person you built your life around. It doesn't happen like in the movies with some big shouting match or a final door slam. Sometimes it's quieter. Sometimes it's a sentence, 7 words that peel something open inside you, and suddenly you can't unsee the truth. For me, it was, my body, my rules. Deal with it. I didn't respond at first. I just sat there in the living room, staring at the soft flicker of the TV. I wasn't even watching. She stood by the doorway, arms crossed like she had just won a debate, like I was the unreasonable one for even bringing it up. It had started with a change in energy. That's the only way I can describe it. There wasn't another man's shirt left in our bedroom or a suspicious text I caught by accident. It was more subtle, a disconnect. The way her eyes no longer searched for mine when she laughed. The way her phone always seemed to be face down lately, or the new interest in late-night yoga classes when she'd never cared for it before. I didn't want to believe anything bad was happening. I really didn't. I spent weeks convincing myself it was in my head, that I was projecting insecurities, that maybe I was the one drifting, maybe I was the one who needed to work harder. But I couldn't shake the feeling. So one evening, I asked gently, respectfully, if everything was okay, if she still felt connected to us. To me, I didn't accuse her of anything. I just asked. That's when she gave me the line, that sentence. My body, my rules. Deal with it. She didn't say it with anger. She said it with distance, like she had already walked out of the relationship in her mind, and I was just catching up. That night, something shifted in me. Not rage, not jealousy, just a cold, sad clarity. I realized that I had been holding on to something that no longer existed. I had been showing up to a relationship she had already emotionally vacated. The next few days were quiet. We shared meals, slept in the same bed, laughed at something our son said, but it was all autopilot. I watched her live a life parallel to mine, like we were two strangers pretending we remembered how to be close. I didn't confront her again. There was nothing left to confront. Instead, I started to look inward. I started writing again, something I hadn't done in years. I found myself journaling late into the night. Not angry thoughts, just reflections. Memories, the slow erosion of love, the difference between companionship and connection. How silence can sometimes scream louder than words. I realized I've been trying to fix something alone, and that's not what marriage is supposed to be. She went out more often. She didn't offer explanations anymore, and I didn't ask. But I noticed she stopped checking whether I'd be home, stopped wondering if I wanted to join her. It was as if she was easing herself into a life where I didn't exist. So, I began preparing to give her what she already seemed to want. Not revenge, not punishment, just freedom. And I'd give it to her so quietly that when she noticed, I'd already be gone. She just didn't know it yet. The irony wasn't lost on me. The house felt fuller than ever with noise, with motion, with all the stuff we had accumulated over the years, but I had never felt so completely alone. There's a specific kind of silence that follows you even when you're surrounded by the hum of appliances or the chatter of kids in the next room. A silence that lives between two people who no longer see each other. Tara wasn't cruel. That's what made it harder to explain to anyone else. She still folded the laundry. She still bought almond milk because she knew I hated dairy. She still smiled in front of others. She still kissed me on the cheek when we were around her parents. But it was all surface. The warmth was gone. I stopped trying to chase it. At first, I blamed myself for the shift. Maybe I'd been too distracted with work, too tired lately. Maybe I hadn't been listening when she vented. I ran through my past actions, trying to pinpoint the moment she began stepping away, but I couldn't find it. And I realized that sometimes the damage isn't loud. Sometimes people drift so slowly that by the time you notice the distance, they're already too far out to reach. She had built a life inside our life that didn't include me. I saw it in little moments, like when I'd enter the room and she'd quickly flip her phone upside down, or the time I caught her smiling at a message she didn't bother to hide but didn't share either. There was an entire world behind her eyes that I wasn't welcome in anymore. The worst part? I didn't ask. Not because I didn't care, but because I already knew the answer, and hearing it out loud wouldn't change the outcome. It would just make it real. One afternoon, she left her laptop open. That wasn't like her. She usually carried it like a diary, always zipped into her bag or tucked under her arm when she left the house. But that day, maybe she forgot. Or maybe she didn't care anymore. I didn't go looking for anything. I swear to you, I didn't. But a message popped up on the screen as I passed by. Tonight then. Usual place. No name, no emoji, just that. And her reply underneath. Timestamped 10 minutes earlier. Can't wait. I need you. I sat down, not angrily, not with some dramatic plan to dig through every message and piece together a crime. I just sat there the way you do when you finally understand what you've known all along. And I didn't cry. I didn't clench my fists or pace the room. I just breathed a long, slow breath that felt like it came from the deepest part of me, a breath that marked the end of something. I closed the laptop. I didn't check anything else. I didn't need to know who it was. I didn't want to see pictures or read more words that would stay with me forever. I just closed it, stood up, and decided that I would not be living in this quiet heartbreak any longer. But I didn't confront her. That part surprises most people when I tell them. I didn't blow up her phone or storm into the kitchen demanding answers. There was nothing left to win. If I had to ask her to stop, to choose me, then I had already lost. Instead, I started pulling away, but quietly, thoughtfully. I made copies of my important documents. I called my old friend in Portland who had once offered me a role at his firm, something I had brushed off years ago because Tara didn't want to leave her yoga group and wine nights. I reactivated my private bank account, the one I hadn't touched since before we married. I even started jogging again, not because I wanted a revenge body, but because I needed clarity. Every morning, I'd wake up and pretend like everything was the same. We'd sit through coffee together. I'd ask about her plans for the day. She'd give vague answers about meetings or appointments, and I'd nod, pretending I believed her. But inside I was preparing. Preparing not to punish her, not to shame her, just to let go fully. I began packing boxes in the garage when she wasn't home. Just small things at first. Books I loved, old photo albums, a leather journal I hadn't opened since our honeymoon. I didn't want a scene. I didn't want drama. I just wanted to disappear so quietly she wouldn't realize it until the echo of me had faded completely. I told myself I'd wait for one last sign, one more moment that confirmed I wasn't just reacting emotionally, that I wasn't running from discomfort. I didn't have to wait long. Came on a Sunday morning. Our son had gone to a friend's overnight. I made breakfast just like I always did, eggs, toast, orange juice. She came into the kitchen in a robe I'd never seen before, black silk. Not my style, not something I'd ever bought for her. She looked surprised to see me. "You're still here?" she said, blinking like I'd caught her off script. "Where else would I be?" I asked, my voice level. She smiled. Not sheepishly, not kindly. It was that same distant, dismissive smile I'd come to dread. "My body, my rules," she shrugged. "You don't get to ask questions." And just like that, I had my answer. I smiled back. And later that day, while she was out again, God knows where, I quietly packed the rest of what I needed. I didn't take anything that wasn't mine. I didn't touch the savings. I left the house keys on the kitchen counter and I walked away. Not because I hated her, but because I finally loved myself enough to stop asking someone to choose me. Have you ever looked around a place and felt like a ghost in your own life? That was me 2 weeks before I disappeared. I wasn't gone yet, but I was already fading from the spaces we used to share. I started seeing the house less as a home and more like a collection of scenes I had been edited out of. Her laughter on the phone, never with me. The smell of perfume that clung to her coat, even when she said she'd just been running errands. The way she closed her laptop just a second too fast when I entered the room. I noticed everything not out of paranoia, but because silence sharpens the senses. It was strange. The more I mentally distanced myself from her, the more observant I became. I started seeing patterns. How she dressed differently when she thought I wouldn't be home. How she always made sure to call from the car so I could hear traffic behind her. Like that alone proved she was where she claimed to be. She was always curating evidence, planting alibis into her words. But I didn't challenge her. That's what made it so surreal. I didn't accuse, didn't chase, didn't fall into the role of the bitter husband. I just watched. I observed like a man preparing for the final scene in a play he didn't write. And all the while I was planning in silence. There was something poetic about disappearing without a dramatic send-off. No screaming match, no ultimatums, no attempts to fix what she'd already chosen to break. I wasn't running from her. I was returning to myself. I rented a small, furnished apartment downtown. Month-to-month lease, clean walls, quiet building, no shared history. Felt like a blank page. And for the first time in years, that didn't scare me. At night, I'd lie awake in that temporary bed and let my mind unravel everything that had led me here. Not just the betrayal, but the subtle erosion that had gone unchecked for years. I realized I had slowly edited myself out of my own needs. I tolerated silence. I'd accepted half-truths. I'd mistaken survival for love. And still, I didn't hate her. That part catches people off guard when they ask me. I didn't hate Tara. I didn't even resent her. I pitied the choices she made, but I also recognized the versions of myself that had allowed her to make them without consequence. But I also knew I couldn't stay another day pretending we were still us. So, I set the date, a Tuesday. I picked it because it felt like a day no one expects anything major to happen. No weekend drama, no birthday or anniversary to taint. Just an ordinary Tuesday that she would never forget for entirely different reasons. The night before, I stood in the doorway of our bedroom and just looked at her. She was asleep, one hand tucked under her cheek, peaceful, as if she had no idea the person next to her had already left emotionally. Maybe she didn't. Maybe she'd stopped looking for me a long time ago. I wanted to remember her like that. Not the version that lied. Not the one that whispered to someone else in the dark. Just this quiet image of a woman I once loved with everything I had. It was the cleanest goodbye I could give myself. The next morning I got up earlier than usual. The house was still wrapped in sleep. I took a slow shower, got dressed, packed the last few things into the trunk of my car. Books, a box of old journals, a framed photo of my dad and me at a baseball game when I was 11. Just essentials, just reminders of who I was before I became someone else's background character. I left a letter on the kitchen table. Not a plea, not a confession, just a statement of truth. I didn't explain everything. I didn't write a novel, but I made it clear. I knew. And I was done. No hate, no war, just the end. As I locked the door behind me, I didn't feel triumphant. There was no swelling music, no cinematic fade-out, just an almost painful quiet. But inside, something opened up, a space I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't happiness yet, but it was freedom, and I was ready to step into whatever came next, even if she never saw me again. The first morning after I left, I woke up in silence. Not the heavy silence of a house filled with tension and unspoken resentment. Not the kind where someone is in the next room pretending you're not there. No, this was a pure kind of quiet, a stillness so complete it didn't feel like absence. Felt like peace. I stared at the unfamiliar ceiling above me. White, plain, no cracks, no history. Nothing had happened here yet. That was the beauty of it. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying anyone else's emotions the second I opened my eyes. I made a cup of coffee and sat by the window. No television, no phone in my hand. I just watched the city wake up. People walking dogs, buses rumbling by, a couple arguing about parking meters. Life moved on without needing me to perform, to explain, to apologize for things I didn't do. And that's when it hit me. I hadn't realized how much of myself I had muted in order to keep the illusion of our marriage intact. How many days I had let pass with a lump in my throat, telling myself, it's not the right time to bring this up, or maybe tomorrow she'll be different. I had been waiting for the return of someone who had already moved on. That realization didn't bring tears. It didn't even bring relief. It just landed heavy but necessary, like a book being closed after a long chapter. I turned my phone over. 46 missed calls, 17 texts, all from her. The first few were casual. Hey, where are you? Can you pick up eggs on your way back? Then came the shift. Why aren't you answering? Are you seriously ignoring me? And finally, "You better tell me what's going on. This isn't funny." I didn't open any of them, not out of cruelty. I simply knew that nothing she said would make me feel seen, understood, or valued. She would spin it as she always had, play the victim, tell me I was being dramatic, accuse me of running away from a rough patch. But what she called a rough patch I knew was a slow, emotional death. 2 hours later, another message came through. I didn't look at it right away. I poured another cup of coffee. I looked out at the skyline. I opened my journal and wrote down one sentence. "Sometimes people don't leave you. They just stop showing up." When I finally opened the new message, it wasn't what I expected. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even a question. It simply said, "So you're just going to disappear?" Seriously. There it was. Proof. Even in this moment, it was about her. About how my choice to walk away impacted her. Not what led me there. Not what I had silently endured. Not the betrayal. Not the night after night of cold distance. Lies she thought were subtle, and conversations that ended before they began. Just outrage that I had made a move without her permission. The truth was, I hadn't disappeared. I had reappeared in my own life. It wasn't a revenge play. It wasn't about causing her pain. I simply stopped accepting less than the love and honesty I deserved. And that kind of exit always feels like a betrayal to the one who's benefited from your silence. Later that day, I got an email not from her, but from her sister, Leah. We hadn't spoken much over the last few years. She was one of the few people who saw through Tara's performance, though she never said it outright. The subject line was simple: "Are you okay?" Inside it said, "I don't want to get in the middle of anything, but I just wanted to say, I've seen how things have been, and if you ever need to talk, I'm here." That message nearly broke me. Not because I needed saving, but because it reminded me that someone had noticed, that I wasn't crazy, that I hadn't imagined the emotional abandonment, that someone had seen me quietly holding everything together. I didn't reply that day, but I held on to her words like a lifeline. That night I went for a walk. No destination, no music in my ears. I just moved through the streets, listening to the city, feeling my own breath. There was something sacred about walking with no plan, no pressure. I passed a bookstore and went inside. Picked up a novel I hadn't seen since college. Bought it just like that. The freedom to choose even something that small felt revolutionary. I knew the days ahead would be hard. I knew there would be guilt. I'd miss our son. I'd miss pieces of what we were. But I also knew, without question, that I couldn't go back. I had seen the truth too clearly. The emotional neglect, the quiet contempt in her voice when I asked anything too vulnerable, the way she slowly edited me out of her life and expected me to just keep applauding from the sidelines. Not anymore. Tomorrow I'd block her number. Not out of spite, but to protect my peace. I was done being reachable to someone who never really tried to reach me. There's something peculiar about living in a new space with no past. No dents on the walls. No coffee rings on the nightstand. No toothpaste caps left askew. No inside jokes echoing from the kitchen. Everything is neutral. And in that neutrality, something unexpected starts to happen. You begin to hear yourself again. Not the voice you use at work or with family or even in arguments, but the quieter one, the one that used to show up late at night when the house was still, long before life started demanding so much. It had been years since I'd heard mine. That voice didn't ask for revenge. It didn't burn with anger. It didn't even ask for closure. It just wanted to breathe. And in the days that followed my disappearance, that's all I did. Breathe. I didn't rush to rebuild. I didn't try to find myself through some flashy reinvention. I didn't fall into distractions. I allowed the quiet to do its work. But it wasn't easy. By day 3, word had started to spread. I knew it would. Tara wasn't the kind of person to keep her confusion to herself. Control had always been her language, and I had broken her rhythm. Friends started messaging, some out of concern, some clearly fishing for gossip, some pretending to care but really just craving the story. I ignored all of them politely, quietly. I wasn't bitter. I just didn't want to be explained, justified, or labeled. I didn't want to be part of her narrative anymore. I had left, not to make a point, but to stop shrinking inside a life that no longer fit me. Then came the unexpected call. It wasn't from her. It wasn't from her sister, Leah, either. It was from my old college roommate, Devin, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, someone who had seen me through my worst breakup before Tara. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't probe or pretend to understand the situation. He just said, "Man, I know I haven't earned the right to show up after all these years, but if you need a couch or a road trip or just someone to tell you you're not insane, I'm here." And for the first time in days, I laughed. It wasn't a big, cinematic laugh, but it was real, like something had unclenched inside me. That evening, I sat alone with a glass of water. No TV, no music, just silence. And I wrote something down that surprised me. She thought she had control over me because I let her believe she did. But now that I'm gone, she's learning the difference between being followed and being chosen. I didn't leave because I hated her. I left because I realized I had been waiting to be chosen again. And I finally understood that waiting for someone to remember your value is the slowest kind of self-destruction. Then, a few days later, I received the letter. Yes, an actual handwritten letter. No name on the envelope, but the handwriting, I knew it. Tara always curled her Y like a looped ribbon. She was the last person I expected to pick up a pen. The envelope wasn't dramatic. No perfume, no frills, just a single sheet of paper with a single sentence. "If you were going to leave, you should have had the decency to let me say something first." There it was again. Decency. As if my silence was more offensive than her dishonesty. As if her permission was a requirement for my peace. I didn't reply, not because I didn't care, but because I was no longer playing her game. We had spent years with me asking questions she didn't want to answer and her offering statements she never wanted challenged. This wasn't about decency. This was about losing control. And for the first time, she couldn't spin the story. I had walked away without making a scene, without throwing accusations, without begging. Just gone. Later that night, I revisited something I hadn't done since I was a teenager. I painted. It wasn't good. I didn't even have the right supplies. But I didn't care. It wasn't about the result. It was about the return. The act of reconnecting with a part of myself I had buried in compromise. With every brushstroke, I felt a little more present, a little more whole. I wasn't healing in a montage-worthy way. I wasn't suddenly stronger, smarter, or enlightened. But I was learning how to take up space again. And the strange thing was, as I re-entered my life, I realized how little of me had been left in the one I had built with her. We had shared a mortgage, a schedule, a table, but not a heart. That table, the one she sat at while giving me her now famous line, "My body, my rules," wasn't sacred. It was an altar to indifference. And no matter how gently I had tried to love her, you can't reach someone who's already walking towards someone else in their mind. And now she'd never get to walk back. Not because I barred the door, but because I took the door with me when I left. The first time I saw her again, it was by accident. Almost 2 months had passed. 2 entire months of silence. Not the awkward kind that follows a fight, but the deliberate kind, the kind you earn. I had made myself unreachable, untraceable, and as far as she knew, uninterested in ever hearing her voice again. But the city is never as big as you think it is. I was sitting at a small cafe on 10th Street. It had those quiet corners that make you forget time exists. Wooden chairs that creaked a little too much, chipped ceramic mugs that made you feel like a regular, even if it was your first time. I was halfway through a book I couldn't stop rereading when I caught movement outside the foggy window. It was her, Tara. She was standing on the other side of the glass, looking straight at me. The moment stretched. There was no smile, no fury, no signal. Just a frozen breath between 2 people who used to share a life and now barely shared eye contact. She looked smaller. Not physically, just somehow diminished. Her posture wasn't what I remembered. She used to stand like she was preparing for applause. But that day, she looked like she didn't know what to do with her own hands. She didn't come in. I didn't wave. Eventually, she walked away. I didn't follow her. I didn't call her name. And that silence, that refusal to react, wasn't coldness. It was proof of how far I had come. Once, her smallest expressions dictated my emotional climate. Now, I was weathering my own storm and learning how to stand still in it. Later that night, I thought about how strange it was to see her outside of our spaces. No kitchen light behind her. No staircase framing her body. Just her, out there, moving through her day like I was never a chapter. Like she had rewritten the book without me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I had seen it in her face. She hadn't expected to see me. She hadn't known what to do when she did. And there it was again, the difference between control and connection. You can control a narrative, but you can't fake a bond that's already broken. The next day, I got an email. Not from her lawyer. It was professional, cold, almost sterile. Subject line: informal notice of property division. One paragraph followed by a spreadsheet. She wanted the house. She offered to buy me out. No message, no apology, no comment, just numbers. I stared at the screen for a long time. Not because I cared about the money, but because it confirmed what I had already learned the day I walked away. This wasn't about reconciliation. It was about formalizing the distance she had already emotionally imposed years ago. She wasn't writing to reach me. She was writing to erase me neatly. I didn't reply right away. I closed the laptop and let the silence breed again. The thing is, I wasn't the man I had been when I left. I had rebuilt in small, quiet ways. I'd made friends again. I had gone hiking alone, not for exercise, but to listen. I had painted 3 more canvases, not because they were good, they weren't, but because they were mine. I had started eating dinner at the bar of my favorite bookshop, where no one asked questions and the owner gave me free pie when he saw me reading poetry. I was living, not escaping. I didn't need to prove a point, and that's why I didn't respond to her lawyer. Not immediately. I let her sit in the same silence she used to punish me with. I let her wonder where I stood. 2 weeks later, she sent a second notice, this time from a different firm. The tone was sharper, less spreadsheet, more pressure. And then finally, her name appeared in my inbox. No alias, no initials, just, from Tara. Subject: are you going to make this difficult? The message was short. You're being cruel. I just want to move on. I offered you something fair. Can we please be adults about this? I read it twice, then a third time. Not a single sentence about what really happened. Not one word about the nights I sat alone waiting for answers. Not one moment of recognition that I had disappeared. Not in spite of her, but because of her. I didn't respond to the message, but I finally sent a reply to her attorney. Short, professional, emotionless. Acceptable. Please handle through formal channels. No direct contact necessary. And with that, it was done. She had made the rules. I simply stopped showing up to play by them. The next morning, I stood by the same cafe window she had looked through weeks earlier. I wondered if she'd pass by again. I wondered if she was still waiting for me to return to the role she had written for me. The one where I forgive quickly, ask for little, and stay quiet. But that man had left with no suitcase and no goodbye. And this version of me, he wasn't coming back. Some endings don't come with a final conversation. They don't arrive through explosive arguments or cinematic goodbyes. Some endings reveal themselves slowly, like a door that was left open. Not slammed shut, but forgotten. That's how it was with Tara. Took weeks, maybe even months, but eventually, she stopped trying to pull me back. The emails dried up. Her lawyer finalized the numbers. I signed the documents with a borrowed pen at a borrowed desk in a borrowed life that was becoming more mine every day. And then nothing. No messages, no calls, no staged accidental run-ins. At first, I thought that silence would bring relief. I thought it would taste like victory, like the last scene in a story where the protagonist wins by walking away. But it didn't. Tasted like clarity. Because what I realized in that space, in the void that followed her absence, was that I had never truly been seen by her. Not as a whole person. I had been useful. I had been present. I had even been loved in a conditional way. But seen? No. She had loved the version of me that didn't interrupt her rhythm. And once I began to listen to my own voice again, I no longer fit her melody. I began to notice things I hadn't noticed before. Not about her but about myself. How I moved through the world. How often I said sorry without meaning to. How rarely I looked people in the eye. How tightly I clenched my jaw when ordering coffee. How I always waited an extra second to let others speak first, as if their thoughts had more value. I had spent years shrinking myself into a version that wouldn't provoke discomfort, a version that wouldn't be called needy, too emotional, or dramatic. Tara didn't demand that, but she never made room for anything else either. And now that I had room, I was learning to fill it. It started with small things. A new couch in my apartment, not expensive, just mine. A record player I'd always wanted. A weekend trip to Seattle alone. No itinerary. No check-ins. Dinner with Leah. Yes, her sister. Not out of rebellion, but out of truth. Because Leah had seen what I had lived through and never sugarcoated it. She didn't ask about the breakup. She asked about me. "What do you like now?" she said over soup in a quiet corner booth. "Now that you don't have to like anything for anyone else?" It was such a simple question. And yet I had no answer. So I started figuring it out. I tried things. Jazz instead of podcasts, painting with oils instead of acrylics, reading poetry again instead of business books I never liked. I picked up the guitar I had left in storage for 10 years. My fingers were clumsy, but something in me remembered. It didn't have to sound good. It just had to be mine. And then one afternoon on a walk home from the bookstore, I passed by a community center. There was a flyer on the bulletin board. Saturday night conversations. No pressure, no judgment, no agenda. Just people who want to listen and be heard. I went not to talk about her, not even to talk about myself, just to sit in a room where words weren't weapons, where people spoke without pretense, where nobody was pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. A woman in her 60s talked about losing her dog. A man in his 30s talked about how scared he was of being a father. A teenager talked about being invisible in her own family. And for the first time, I saw a truth I hadn't considered before. This wasn't just about a failed marriage. It was about belonging, about having a voice not for approval but for connection. I didn't speak that night. I just listened. But I went back the next week and the week after. And then one night I spoke. I said, I used to think silence meant peace. That if I wasn't arguing, I was doing something right. But now I know silence can be the most exhausting performance in the world. Nobody clapped. Nobody needed to. They just nodded. And something in me exhaled. Meanwhile, I heard from a friend that Tara had started telling people I checked out emotionally years ago, that I had just walked away with no warning. I didn't correct her because I didn't need to. Let her version float wherever it needed to float. I wasn't interested in dragging her name through the mud or stitching myself into her narrative again. I had my own pages to write. But then something strange happened. One evening I got a letter, not from her this time, from a mutual friend. Inside was a single photo. It was from 4 years ago. The two of us standing on a beach, arms around each other, the wind blowing her hair across my face. On the back, in handwriting I didn't recognize, was one line. "This was the last time you looked truly happy." There was no signature, just that. I don't know who sent it. Maybe it was her. Maybe it was Leah. Maybe it was someone else entirely. But I kept the photo not to remember her, but to remember me, the version of me that was still fully alive before I began dimming my light to make space for her shadow. And now, with one part of my life fading further into the past and a different self slowly emerging from the wreckage, I understood something important. You don't lose yourself in one moment. You give yourself away in pieces. And the only way back is to reclaim them, one quiet, beautiful piece at a time. It's been a year, 12 months, 365 days, countless sunrises I actually noticed, conversations I actually listened to, cups of coffee I drank slowly, not on my way to anywhere. I live in a smaller apartment now, fewer windows but more light, not because of where it faces but because of how I feel inside it. Everything in it I chose. Every object has a story. Every photo is of someone I still speak to. Every book is something I actually want to read. There's no furniture that exists just to match her taste. No decorations I bought just to stop an argument. No reminders of who I used to be in someone else's world. And most importantly, the silence here is kind. It welcomes me when I come home. It wraps around me, not like a punishment, but like permission. I talk to people more now, not because I need them to fill space, but because I finally enjoy sharing mine. I have a few close friends. I call my mom every Sunday. I teach an art class at the community center on Thursdays. Mostly beginners, mostly messy, but always full of laughter. And sometimes I catch myself smiling for no reason. Not because someone did something funny, not because I received good news, just because I feel like I belong in my life again. A few weeks ago, I ran into someone I hadn't seen since before the divorce. She paused, stared at me for a moment and said, "You look lighter." I thanked her, but I didn't explain why. Because how do you explain to someone that the heaviness wasn't just sadness or stress? It was the slow erosion of self. And how do you explain that the lightness came not from changing the world, but from no longer carrying someone else's version of you? I haven't heard from Tara in months. Not directly, but I've heard she moved again. Different city, a fresh start, maybe. I hope she's well. I truly do. Not out of politeness, but because I no longer need her to hurt for me to heal. We were two people who drifted too far in silence, and we didn't know how to come back. That happens sometimes. The bravest thing you can do is accept when something has run its course, not out of failure, but out of respect for what once was. She said, "My body, my rules." And maybe she was right, but what she didn't realize is that I have rules too. And mine say, I will not stay where I am not heard. I will not beg to be chosen. I will not keep shrinking to fit inside someone else's comfort. And most of all, I will never again ask for love that has to be begged for. I've learned to choose peace not as a passive state but as an active one. Peace takes work, takes boundaries, takes the courage to say no more without shouting. And now I sit at a small cafe, not the one where I saw her, but one a few blocks away with better pastries and a view of the park. There's a notebook in front of me nearly full. Some days I write about nothing. Other days I write about everything. Today I'm writing this not for closure, but because somewhere out there, someone might be sitting in a life that doesn't feel like there's any more. Someone might be shrinking to be loved, losing themselves in exchange for silence. And if they're reading this, I want them to know you're allowed to walk away. You're allowed to start over. Not in spite of love, but because you finally understand what love isn't. This story didn't end with fireworks. It ended with a quiet door closing and another one opening inside me. And this time, I stepped through it with no fear and no one else's voice guiding the way.